Good day. As if the international situation were not tense enough with the growing crisis in the Asia-Pacific region as Taiwan edges towards declaring itself independent of China, confirms the presence of US troops on Taiwanese territory, and receives support from the US State Department for its independence drive, and statements from the US President about the United States being committed to defend Taiwan. As if that situation were not problematic already, there is growing tension in another part of the world where the United States and its allies are facing off against the Eurasian powers, and that is Ukraine. Now, as many of you will recall, back in April, there was a moment of apparently dangerous crisis when Ukraine mobilized large numbers of troops and positioned them along the ceasefire line between Ukraine and the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. The Russians responded with an enormous build-up of forces on the Ukraine's border and started issuing threatening warnings that if there was a war in eastern Ukraine, if the Ukrainians attempted to overrun the two breakaway republics, Russia would react and there would be a general war, and that would be the end of Ukraine. That was what the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said at the time. Well, things are not quite as bad as that now, but they are deteriorating again. All diplomatic discussions, all attempts by the Europeans to try to organize discussions between the Russians and the Ukrainians are at a standstill. Ukraine adamantly refuses to talk to the leaders of the two breakaway republics, as it is required to do under the Minsk agreement. At the same time, the Russians refuse to speak directly to the Ukrainians, saying that the Ukrainians need to negotiate with the people in the two breakaway republics to resolve what Russia officially considers to be an internal crisis within Ukraine itself. And the Western powers come along, reassure the Russians that on the one hand, they support the Minsk agreement, but at the same time, they support Ukraine as it seeks to undermine the Minsk agreement. Meanwhile, the economic situation in Ukraine becomes increasingly bad as Ukraine finds itself short of gas and energy, and as living standards in Ukraine continue to fall, and as the popularity of the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky declines along with the economy. And in response to all of this, and perhaps unsurprisingly, there has been a resumption of tension, of actual fighting, in fact, along the contact line, this time between Ukraine and the Donetsk People's Republic. And what happened was that over the last few days, there was a Ukrainian attack on an artillery position of the Donetsk People's Republic. It's been confirmed that the Ukrainians used a Turkish-supplied drone to attack the particular artillery unit. The Ukrainians say they destroyed the artillery unit. The Donetsk People's Republic report rather more plausibly that just one of their people was killed. The Ukrainians then launched an attack, which then captured a settlement that lies between the two forces, but the Donetsk militia appears to have counterattacked, and it's now been confirmed that they are in reoccupation of that settlement. Anyway, this was clearly a skirmish. It was not in any way an intentional offensive. There's been no reports of the kind of military build-ups that we saw on both sides in April, but it does look as if the situation is becoming more tense. And this has provoked some very strong comments from the Russians. And some of these comments came in a detailed briefing provided by the redoubtable Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman, Maria Zakharova, in which she discussed the situation in southeastern Ukraine. Now, I'm not going to read out all her comments in detail, but I am going to discuss briefly what Zakharova had to say about this particular skirmish and the way in which she makes the NATO powers responsible for the fact that this skirmish took place. And she said the following: "We have been witnessing tragic developments in southeastern Ukraine over these past days. There has been a serious escalation in the conflict zone. According to media reports, on October 26, 2021, the Ukrainian armed forces launched an offensive in the so-called grey zone along the line of contact and tried to take the village of Staromarievka. That's the settlement I mentioned. Territories outside of Kiev's control saw a substantial increase in the number of shelling incidents, including with heavy artillery. This destroyed single-family homes in Donbass and damaged civilian infrastructure. 12 electrical substations were left without power. So far, there have been no reports of civilian casualties, but we cannot rule out a further deterioration considering the situation. We would like to emphasize that the Ukrainian military and security agencies have been intentionally violating the additional measures to strengthen the ceasefire which were agreed upon in July 2020. They are resolved to further escalate an already challenging situation and ignore the requests to guarantee ceasefire compliance made by Donbass representatives within the Joint Centre for Control and Coordination. Against this backdrop, the October 27, 2021 meeting of the contact group on settling the crisis in eastern Ukraine did not yield any results as expected. Moreover, and this is an essential point, it is the unwillingness of the Ukrainian side, represented by the official government in Kiev, to free a Lugansk representative in the Joint Centre for Control and Coordination, Andrei Kostyak, who has been taken prisoner, which blocks the work of the contact group's subgroup on security. Despite statements by officials, Kiev has not bothered to grant the Russian consular staff access to this citizen who, for the record, holds a Russian passport. The Russian embassy in Kiev and the consulate general in Kharkov persist in their efforts to arrange a meeting with Mr. Kostyak. Undoubtedly, the ODYSEE Special Monitoring Mission has not mentioned in its reports the incident with the Lugansk representative in the Joint Centre for Control and Coordination. Russia insists on the mission's strict compliance with its mandate and on including facts on violations of this kind in its reports in a timely manner. It seems that Kiev intentionally seeks to drive the talks within the contact group into an impasse in order to free its hands to return Donbass by military means. The continuing arms and ammunition supplies that are flowing into Ukraine from Western countries and their military training missions in the country make the Ukrainian leadership even more confident that a solution by force is possible. The same goes for the multiple joint military exercises with NATO countries. There must be a reason for this military aid and military presence in Ukraine. If we switch from military language to literature, Anton Chekhov offers a description that is quite pertinent. He wrote, "If you say in the first chapter that there is a rifle hanging on the wall, in the second or third chapter, it absolutely must go off." This is from Anton Chekhov's letter to literary critic Alexander Lazarev-Gruzinski. The same applies to weapons that the Western countries are delivering in huge quantities to Ukraine. Let me remind you, yet again, that there is no military solution to the conflict in southeastern Ukraine. This has been stipulated by the same countries that care for civilians and the developments in Ukraine. Attempts to settle the conflict by force will have the most regrettable, unpredictable, and tragic consequences. Now, what Zakharova is saying here, and by the way, she says a great deal more. She talks about the fact that the Western powers have also been providing training to people she categorizes, rightly in my opinion, as ultra-hard right neo-Nazi militia groups. What Zakharova is saying is that the Ukrainians have no interest in implementing the Minsk agreement. They have no interest in abiding by the ceasefire provisions. They're getting arms from the West, Javelin, especially Javelin missiles from the United States. They're getting drones from Turkey, and this is encouraging them to think that they might at some point be able to launch an offensive in eastern Ukraine and might succeed in capturing these two regions, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, by force. However, if they try to do that, then Ukraine will face tragic, unpredictable consequences because there is no military solution to this problem. That is, of course, a clear hint of Russian action in that case to defend and protect the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. And whilst Zakharova refers and goes out of her way to refer to the fact that one particular official of the Lugansk People's Republics has been arrested by the Ukrainians, note how she goes out of her way to emphasize the fact that as this official has a Russian passport, he is entitled to Russian consular protection by the way which the Ukrainians refuse to acknowledge. If there is a conflict in eastern Ukraine, much of the population there now hold Russian passports, and the Russians would in that case be under a legal duty, as they see it, to protect them. So there would undoubtedly be a conflict, and the Russians would react by force. They made that clear in April. Putin has issued a long essay, historical essay, about Ukraine, which essentially amounts to him saying the same thing. And in fact, he said it on many occasions. The Russian Prime Minister, Dmitry Medvedev, former Prime Minister and former President Dmitry Medvedev, has talked in similar ways. He's written a long piece about this, which I discussed in detail on Locals. And of course, Sergei Lavrov actually said back in April that if there was an attempt by Ukraine to bring the two breakaway republics back into Ukraine by force, then there would be a war, and that war would be the end of Ukraine. Now, I don't have any doubt about this, but note also something else that Zakharova said. She's asking the question why, given that a war in eastern Ukraine would result in the end of Ukraine, Western governments are continuing to supply arms, Javelin missiles, Turkish drones, and the rest to Ukraine. And she quotes this extraordinarily famous comment, at least in Russia, that was made by Anton Chekhov all the way back in the 1880s in a private letter to a critic, which is that if in a play you have a rifle on the wall in the first act, then that means that rifle must go off by the last act. That is a very famous comment by Chekhov. Every Russian school child knows it. And of course, what she's signaling to the Russians is that the West's arms supplies to Ukraine, which, by the way, are in nothing like the quantity that she implies, but those Western arms supplies are intended eventually to trigger a battle in Ukraine, a battle which Ukraine would lose. Now, I've been discussing in programs about how the Russians would react to an offensive, a Ukrainian offensive in eastern Ukraine, but there's also been a very interesting commentary by a Western journalist and political commentator, one of the few that on Russian affairs one should take wholly seriously, and that is Anatol Lieven. And he's written about this on the website of the Quincy Institute. The website calls itself Responsible Statecraft. And he's written it in the immediate aftermath of the Valdai Conference, which is a major meeting place of top-level thinkers and academics and intellectuals and foreign policy commentators who meet with the Russian leadership in connection with this conference, which has taken place in Russia. Now, the article itself doesn't say that Lieven was actually present at Valdai, but I suspect that he was. And I would add that Lieven himself has an exceptional knowledge of Russia. He is very much an expert on Russian affairs. He speaks fluent Russian, and of course he has Russian antecedents. He comes from an aristocratic family that left Russia after the revolution, but which maintained its contacts there. His brother Dominic Lieven is a celebrated historian of Imperial Russian history, and Anatol Lieven understands Russia and the Russians very well. And by the way, just glancing again at the article, I see that it does in fact confirm he was actually at Valdai, and he did actually have discussions there with the Russian officials about the situation in Ukraine. And I'm going to read out what he says in full because I found it both extremely interesting and very ominous. And he reads as follows. To judge by my conversations at the Valdai Conference, the Russian establishment's feelings about Ukraine are balanced between hope, indifference, and fear. Which of these sentiments prevails will be decisive for Ukraine, for Russia's relations with the West, and for global politics in the generations to come. On the one hand, there is a belief in Russia that Russia can afford to wait because the existing, bitterly divided Ukrainian state is paralyzed and doomed to further decay and will never, in fact, join the European Union or NATO. This, they hope, will gradually turn a majority of Ukrainians against the existing order and lead to a new desire for partnership and trade with Russia. And indeed, there are increasing number of Ukrainians who do, in fact, talk in that way. But then we come to the fear. It is believed by many in Russia that Ukrainian failure to reform and progress will eventually lead to the West becoming completely disillusioned with Ukraine, and to this a belief that the West is itself in long-term decline. Former President Dmitry Medvedev published an article on October 11th bitterly criticizing Ukraine as a state under direct foreign administration with which it was pointless to negotiate. However, he added that Russia is willing to wait until a responsible Ukrainian leadership reappears, adding that we are a patient people. On the other hand, there is a fear strongly expressed by Putin that over time, Ukrainian policies backed by the West will not only eliminate existing pro-Russian business and political elements in Ukraine, but will permanently and irreversibly destroy Russian language and culture in the country. On the whole, I do not think that these fears will lead Russia to launch a wholly premeditated and unprovoked attack on Ukraine. Notice, however, Anatol Lieven's careful use of words, wholly premeditated and unprovoked. Because he then goes on to say, for there is a widespread belief among sections of the Russian establishment that while Russia should defend Donbass and Crimea, it should otherwise build up its own strength at home and ignore Ukraine. And notice again the very careful point. Russia will defend Donbass and Crimea. They won't launch a preemptive strike on Ukraine, despite their concern about the anti-Russian policies of Ukraine, anti-Russian cultural policies currently followed by Ukraine, but they will defend Donbass as well as Crimea. And Lieven then goes on to say, while sensible Russian analysts are not afraid of NATO fighting to defend Ukraine, I don't think there's any Russian analyst who believes NATO will fight to defend Ukraine. They do fear the greatly intensified Western economic sanctions that would almost certainly result from a new war, as well as a complete breakdown in Russia's economically vital relationship with Germany. I will come to that later. The situation is nonetheless extremely delicate and could be upset in a number of different ways. A new Ukrainian offensive in the Donbass, increased Ukrainian pressure on Crimea, a Ukrainian blockade of the Russian peacekeeping force in Transnistria, or political violence within Ukraine itself. If Russia does opt for open military action in Ukraine, then it's likely that the Russian army won't stop at covert action in the Donbass or stop at all short of Ukraine's borders with NATO. For I have also heard that there are also significant hardline elements in the Russian establishment that blame Putin for not going much further in 2014 and blame this on his sentimental attitude towards Germany and Angela Merkel. And then Anatol Lieven goes on further down to make the further point. In these perilous circumstances, what should Ukraine, US and Western strategy be? And then he discusses how West's policy to Ukraine is all over the place, and that the Biden administration seems to be seeking to kick the ball down the road with Ukraine, doesn't seem to have a proper or coherent policy about what to do with Ukraine. And then he talks about the dangers of this. And then Lieven finishes with the following. Genuine US military commitment to Ukraine would imply readiness simultaneously to fight an air-ground war with Russia in Ukraine and an air-sea war with China in the Far East, since, as several Russians pointed out to me, any US-Russia war would probably lead immediately to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Now, that is something that Lieven was told in the Valdai conference by influential Russians that he spoke to. And so what we get from this is that there are people within the Russian political establishment, I suspect especially in the military and in the intelligence community in Russia, who feel that Russia pulled its punches in 2014. I know there are a lot of people in Russia who actually think that, and not just in the military intelligence apparatus. And they basically said that though they're not looking for a war with Ukraine, they expect Ukraine to disintegrate under its own weight, and they believe that in time the West will tire of Ukraine, and the Ukrainians themselves will come to their senses and understand that their only future is in some sort of tie-up with Russia. Now, they're not looking for a tie-up with Ukraine. If Ukraine goes for broke and launches an attack, not just on Crimea, but on the Donbass, Russia will itself react, and it will react with full military force, and they will not stop at the Donbass this time. They will go all the way to NATO's borders. And by that, I don't mean that I think they will take over every inch of Ukraine. I don't think they would seek, for example, to capture the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. but they would probably want to take the Russian-speaking region of Kharkiv and its important industrial city, and I'm fairly sure that they would also seek to regain control of the coastline of Ukraine, which is also predominantly Russian-speaking, including the key port city of Odessa and all of the region in between, which formed an important part of the Soviet Union's industrial base. That would, of course, cut off Ukraine from the Black Sea, and it would render the rest of Ukraine economically unsustainable under any conditions. So I think that is probably what the Russians would do. I mentioned this possibility in a recent live stream, which I did with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou, and we see Anatol Lieven has had discussions with Russian officials at the Valdai conference, and they have told him exactly the same things that I didn't know when I had that discussion with Alex Christoforou on our live stream, but they've been subsequently corroborated by Anatol Lieven in his discussions with those Russian officials at Valdai. So this is what the game plan is. Now, I'm going to say something else, which is, of course, that Anatol Lieven talks about the fact that Russian hardliners think that Putin was wrong not to back off in 2014, and that there are other Russians who worry about sanctions and the fact that the economically vital connection between Russia and Germany would be ruptured if there was a crisis in Ukraine. Now, I have to say that I think this is something of a misunderstanding of the situation. Anatol Lieven is a brilliant political and international affairs commentator. I don't think he has the granular understanding of economics and of Russian economic policy that would enable him to understand this issue well. But briefly, I think in 2014, one of the reasons why there wasn't a full-scale Russian offensive against Ukraine, which went all the way to NATO's borders, is because at that time, the Russians were generally worried about a total breakdown in economic relations with the West. They were worried that relations with Germany would collapse. They were worried that the sanctions war would escalate to an extraordinary degree. And at that time, with the Russian economy deeply integrated with the West, I think they were seriously concerned that in the event of such an all-out sanctions war, the Russian economy would indeed collapse. I think they were particularly concerned at that time about the disconnection, the potential disconnection of Russian banks from the SWIFT interbank payment and messaging system. The reason was that Russian banks used SWIFT to transfer funds between each other. The situation, however, since 2014 has changed completely. Today, Russia is far less dependent on the West than it was. Russian companies no longer borrow from Western banks in the way they did. They're actually unable to do so because of the sanctions that were imposed on Russia back in 2014. The result is that Russia's own domestic financial services industry has evolved to an extent which would have been unimaginable in 2014. Russian banks today are well capitalized. They're able to provide funding to Russian companies in a way that simply did not happen in 2014. And the Russian government, for its part, is able to raise funds, so-called by floating bonds, so-called OFZs, on the Russian financial markets in a way that it didn't do back in 2014. Over and above that, the Russians have also developed a parallel payment and messaging system binding together their banks, their key banks and financial institutions in parallel to SWIFT, which, though currently dormant, could be activated in the event that there was a SWIFT disconnection. Now, I am not saying that there would not be severe disruptions for Russia in the event that there was an all-out sanctions war. There would be, for example, a severe drop in the value of the ruble, but Russia would be able to withstand sanctions of a scale that it could not have withstood back in 2014. Now, I'm going to say this further. Sanctions on Russia are far less effective than they were 7 years ago. Western sanctions are far less effective on Russia than they were 7 years ago. By contrast, Western dependence on Russia and the dependence of the Western economy on Russia has increased. We see that with the current gas crisis in Europe. We see it also with Russia's now pivotal role as the swing producer in terms of the international food market. Russia has become the swing producer for wheat, for all sorts of other food goods, and if the Russians withhold food from the international markets, that could precipitate an even greater inflation crisis than the one we are seeing. Would Western economies, European economies, really want to impose across-the-board sanctions on Russia if those put in jeopardy, for example, Russian gas flows to Europe? Would they want to impose across-the-board sanctions on Russian foodstuffs if that caused food prices to spike? All of this going on at a time of high inflation. Back in 2018, when the West imposed, the United States imposed sanctions on Russia's leading aluminium producer, Rusal, the United States had to quickly row back those sanctions when aluminium prices, global aluminium prices, spiked, creating major cost problems for US car and aircraft manufacturers. If we went into an overall, across-the-board sanctions war with the Russians, it seems to me today the West would be more exposed to such a sanctions war in some respects than Russia is. Because, of course, the Russians have taken steps to strengthen their economy and to organize it in a way that they would, in effect, make them less susceptible to sanctions, far less susceptible to sanctions than they were in 2014, whereas the overall growth, the unacknowledged growth of the Russian economy means that that kind of sanctions war against Russia today would be perhaps unaffordable for the West, or at least would cause real severe economic disruption to the West. But, of course, if the West were to impose sanctions on Russia that stopped short of the ultimate steps of a complete economic rupture, if, for example, the sanctions were purely confined to disconnecting Russia from SWIFT, what would really change? The Russians, as I said, have their own payment and messaging system for their banks, but they would still be able to sell gas and oil as before, and they would still be able to sell grain as before, and manufactured goods they're increasingly selling not in Europe but to Asian markets, which have proved consistently resistant to Western pressure to extend sanctions against Russia. The South Koreans, for example, have recently been in close contacts with Russia. South Korea sees Russia as a friendly country, a major market for South Korean goods. The South Koreans hanker for Russian energy supplies. Would they be willing to go all the way to impose sanctions on the Russians in the way that, say, the Europeans might be. What about India? India would almost certainly refuse to do that. And of course, China, which is the other part of this equation, which we've not discussed, has forged economic relationships with the Russians that now function at a completely different order of magnitude to those which existed back in 2014. So Russia today, I won't say that it's completely sanctions proof. That's an impossible thing for any economy. But it looks far more in a position to withstand sanctions than the West would be if there was an all-out sanctions war. And I am fairly sure that that is an increasing part now of Russian calculations. So if there was a war in eastern Ukraine, then the Russians would be able, I think, to say to themselves, well, this time we've no reason to stop. We can go all the way to Transnistria. We can see about Kharkov and Odessa breaking away from Ukraine. We could even perhaps try and engineer the breakup of Ukraine. I mean, there are other countries, Romania, Hungary, which have claims on Ukraine too. Maybe we could do all of that. We could strengthen our international position that way. We could see off whatever sanctions the West imposes upon us. And it would be the West, actually, that would find itself having to make all the hard decisions and facing the economic crisis if they really decided to go the full way and trying to impose the kind of sanctions that they're talking about. So that, I suspect, is the Russian calculus. There's also something else here, because consider this really extraordinarily ominous point that is in Anatol Lieven's article. Several Russians pointed out to me any US-Russian war would probably lead immediately to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Now, the very high-profile Russians in Valdai, who attend Valdai, Putin was there, for example. If that's really what they were saying to Lieven, and Lieven is somebody that I should say I wholly trust about this, and that is extraordinarily alarming. And it does make me wonder, actually, whether there hasn't been a quiet understanding between the Chinese and the Russians that they will each support the other over Taiwan and Ukrainian questions, and that if there is indeed a war in Ukraine, one which the United States and NATO tries to involve itself in some ways, then at that point the Chinese will respond by launching an attack on Taiwan. And what Lieven has to say about that is that it would be strategic lunacy, leading to the strong likelihood of defeat on both fronts. And he's absolutely right. It's impossible to see the West succeeding in Ukraine against the Russian military, just as it is impossible to see the West succeeding in Taiwan against the Chinese military. There would be not just a debacle, but a debacle on all fronts. In fact, it will be such a crisis that it would put in question the United States' position as the leading power in the world, one that it still just about retains. So this is what Lieven is saying, and I suspect we're starting to see now Russian discussions and Russian thinking about Ukraine, and I think it is hardening. Now, to be very clear, I don't think there's going to be a war in Ukraine this winter. I don't think that the Western powers want that. And I don't think that the Ukrainians yet are ready for it. But if there is a political crisis in Ukraine, and sooner or later, if the economy continues to deteriorate, there very well could be, then some kind of Ukrainian attack on the Donbass becomes increasingly likely. And Zakharova is absolutely right to say that military supplies to the Ukrainians make that prospect more likely. And Zakharova is also right to say that some of the people, some of the neocons who advocate these military supplies, probably do want to see a war between Ukraine and Russia. Neocons have never been good at logistical and economic calculations. That's never something that they've ever really thought through. And I read recently in National Interest, one of these magazines of which the United States proliferates, an extraordinary commentary which actually spoke about using a military defeat for Russia in Ukraine as a mechanism to create a crisis in Russia, which would lead to Russia breaking with China. It's, I thought, a mad idea, but there are some people who appear to think it, and I suspect it does reflect neocon thinking. So it could very well be that all of these arms supplies to Ukraine are indeed being sent to Ukraine with the delusional idea that a war in Ukraine would turn out well for the West. It would be a disaster for the West. Wouldn't be good for Russia, at least in the short term, but for the West, it would potentially be a catastrophe. So what to do? Well, Levin, in this article, talks about Western policy being in conflict and in a state of drift. And he is absolutely right. The best thing to do is to have that talk with the Ukrainians that needs to be made, to persuade the Ukrainians to stop this policy of confrontation, to return to the Minsk agreement, to start to negotiate in earnest for that compromise within Ukraine itself that is the only real solution to this conflict. To quote Anatol Levin again, the only sensible and honourable US and Western course is to seek a political settlement in Ukraine, an essential part of which was set out in the Minsk II agreement of 2015, signed by Russia, Ukraine, France and Germany, and endorsed by the United Nations and the United States. There is no sign of that being done. On the contrary, it seems to me that Western leaders, perhaps sensing that any kind of pressure on Ukraine would enrage the hardliners in their own countries and would create political problems, are unable to grasp that nettle, and as a result are drifting into a situation of potential war in Ukraine, which can only prepare the ground for a debacle. The same again, of course, is happening over Taiwan. It is drift, and it is dangerous drift, one that pays no heed to warnings, fails to understand that the other side is not bluffing, underestimates the other side's strength and will and sense of purpose, and sets up the scene for a disaster. I don't really have much hope that much good is going to come of all of this, but perhaps one day sense will prevail. In Germany, I know, especially, there are a lot of people who feel that the Ukrainian policy has ended up very badly. And I believe also there are people who think the same in France. But unless they are prepared to grasp this nettle, unless they are prepared to talk to the Ukrainians in ways that no Western government has up to now been prepared to do, then it seems to me that we are on a slow motion course towards disaster. Perhaps not this winter, perhaps not next year, but eventually. A disaster similar to the one that we are drifting towards in the Asia Pacific over Taiwan. Well, there is still time and space to turn things round, but the deficit of leadership is remarkable, and I worry that it simply isn't there. Well, thank you for joining me for this program today. I look forward to you joining me in future programs, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. Please also remember to check out Alex's channel. You'll find links under this video. Please also come to our other platforms. And here, at the moment, far and away, the most activity and the most interesting things are happening on Locals. You'll find the link under this video. Also, you'll find that I've recently been doing increasing numbers of live streams on Locals. To be precise, actually, I've done 2, but I intend fully to do a 3rd one next week. You will find that we're doing various other things too. We've started to do historical programs on Locals, Alex and I, which you will be able to see there. We also have much exclusive content on Locals, and members of our community are also active on Locals also. So you can find us on Locals. You can also find us, of course, on other platforms, BitChute, Library, Rumble, which has now, by the way, acquired Locals, and also on the new free speech platform, SuperU. And you can support us if that's what via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, buying our famous Duran magic mugs, the best magic mugs in the world. I should know. I am the great destroyer of mugs. I'm the sort of person who fumbles and breaks things all the time. These mugs are not only beautiful and stylish and keep your tea or coffee hot, they're pretty much indestructible as well, as far as I can confirm. And we also have our famous Duran hats and our hoodies and our sweatshirts and our long sleeve t-shirts and our short sleeve t-shirts, all made from the best possible products. And you can find those all in our shop, and you can support us, of course, also by buying these things from our shop. And if you like this video, please remember to press the like button, and please also remember to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today, and I look forward to you joining me again soon, and have a wonderful day until then.